committee on the topic of a national popular vote. I would like to say to the testifiers, to begin with, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedules, and for some of you traveling a great distance to be with us this morning. My name is Representative Dave Reed. I represent Indiana County, the 62nd Legislative District.
The great thing about the National Popular Vote Compact is it preserves the Electoral College and that major benefit. At the same time, to kind of give a historical and constitutional context, the Constitution of the United States actually gave state legislators three major functions in the federal government. The first function was to draw the districts of congressmen. And for those of you who are in the legislature, you just went through redistricting, you know that the only time your congressman ever even cares a little bit about what you think is when you're drawing their districts. The second function that the Constitution gave to us as state legislators was the ability to elect United States senators. The 17th Amendment, in my opinion, wrongly took away that power. I think it has been a harm in the federal government that state legislators no longer pick the U.S. senators, but that's the way the law is. And that's the way the Constitution was rewritten by the people of this country and the various states, so that's the way it is. The third function that the Constitution gave to the state legislators was the ability to choose how the president was elected. And you go to James Madison, the Federalist number 45, he specifically says that's an important function granted to the state legislators. One of the unfortunate parts about that is state legislators rarely, if ever, investigate that process. What we've been doing for quite a long time. The current system has been in place for quite a long time, and it's not been revisited by the state legislators. Of all the things that the National Popular Vote Compact has done, has got state legislators to really focus on that part of their function and that part of the impact that they can specifically have on the federal government. One of the major problems of our current system is the battleground state system basically leads our presidential candidates to campaign in regions on regional issues. There are very few national issues that are addressed in the political campaign because presidential candidates are afraid if they address, for example, an issue that's a big issue in my area is illegal immigration. It has no impact on the vote in California, has no impact on the vote in Arizona, has no impact on the vote in Texas, where the areas that are the most impacted by illegal immigration, because those aren't battleground states. Then the presidential candidates are concerned that if they campaign on that issue, they'll alienate a voter in Ohio or they'll alienate a voter in Florida. So we end up with regional campaigns on regional issues. Did come to the conclusion that, first of all, yes, it is constitutional. The Article 2, Section 1 is very clear. It granted that power, whether you read the Federalist number 45 or the Federalist number 68, 45 by Madison, 68 by Hamilton. In both of those cases, it was very clear the state legislature has that power. The Supreme Court has held that that power is exclusive and plenary in the state legislatures. Number two, is it good policy? I think it's actually good policy to have presidential candidates campaigning on national issues and campaigning for every single vote in every single state across the country. I think that's a good idea. Finally, is it good for the conservative movement? In my opinion, the biggest thing that has been detrimental to the conservative movement on a national level has been Republican candidates taking positions like Medicare Part D, the largest entitlement of the last 60 years in this country, because they wanted to get 300,000 senior votes in Florida. The idea of campaigning for No Child Left Behind because you wanted to get the women vote in Ohio, or Medicare Part D because you wanted to get the senior vote in Florida. Avoiding illegal immigration as an issue because you're afraid of alienating moderate voters in those states has hurt the conservative movement. Republican candidates taking moderate positions because of the battleground state strategies, in my opinion, has hurt the conservative movement. Ultimately, that's why I changed my mind. Ultimately, that's why I support the National Popular Vote Compact.
90% of the money spent in presidential elections today is spent in only 16 states. And we agree that very few of those states ultimately are described as battleground states, and with each passing election, it becomes fewer and fewer. we are getting candidates that are tailored to very small parts of our population, and as Senator Haynes talked about, then they come out with things like Medicare Part D to appeal to one group of people because they need to win one state out of those 16. Now, another thing that I would like to discuss today is Dr. Madonna talks about how these campaigns will focus on large urban areas. I have news for you. They are focusing on large urban areas today. If you accept something like national popular vote, and again, Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution says you, the legislature in the state of Pennsylvania, and you alone can determine how you want to award these electors. Right now, you're doing it winner take all. Theoretically, and I'm sure this would be subject to innumerable legal challenges, but you theoretically could pass a law that says we're going to award our electors to the tallest candidate. It doesn't mean that you would do that forever. You could change it later. That, again, is within your purview. It is your plenary authority granted under the Constitution of the United States. Why is this important? Because right now we are focused on very few states and, frankly, large urban centers. I've had the argument made to me, Tom, as a conservative, why would you ever want to support something like national popular vote? All they'd have to do is focus their campaigns on the large urban centers. Last time I checked, the top 50 cities in this country, most populated, dense urban areas, make up less than 20% of the popular vote. And by the way, I could be wrong, this might have changed, but Arlington, Texas would be number 50. And it's not the most liberal of constituencies in Arlington. If the money that is coming into Pennsylvania is needed to get out every Republican vote, and I'm talking from a Republican side, I would imagine that Democrats would feel the same way. You will then be spending money at the grassroots level to actually build the organizations that are important to carry that message. You'll get more consistent candidates with the message that they sell instead of trying to be something to everybody. You will get more value for the dollar because it will be put into the ground to get every vote out, not just a few to win electoral votes.
Bottom line on the easiest way to think of elections is every single election in this country is a popular vote election, except president. The largest popular vote election in this country is a governor or senator of California. And as a Californian, I can say without question, none of the problems that have arisen or that have been described have ever occurred in California after 150 years of elections, and lately being the largest popular election in the country. We've not seen any of those sorts of things. You all know how popular elections are run. You run a popular election. You know how it works. You know what precincts you're strong in. You know what precincts you're weak in. You know how to go to the areas where you're strong and how to buttress yourself up in the areas where you're weak. That's exactly how a presidential election would work, just on a larger scale.
Article 2, Section 1. It is constitutional. We're not changing the Constitution. If you respect states' rights, if you truly do believe in them, then you respect the states' rights to determine however they want to award their electors. Because we have had to run candidates that address specific constituencies because they must win just a few states in order to win the Electoral College. We've ended up with Medicare Part D because somebody had to win the I-4 corridor down in Florida. We've ended up with things like No Child Left Behind. Is it any coincidence that a president doesn't show up in Louisiana when the Gulf is being pumped full of oil, and yet the first tar ball that shows up on the western coast of Florida, all of a sudden the president is there? Is it any coincidence that you have fires burning out of control in Texas, you have flooding in Minnesota? Both governors the spring before last request an emergency declaration from the president. Texas doesn't get it, Minnesota does. I think it hasn't worked very well. It's encouraged not only campaigns that are not focused to every citizen in this country, but they're focused based purely on political outcomes instead of what is right for this country. And I think that's why we have to look at this very carefully.
If you break down an election, as you guys know, into three basic parts, you have what I call base building. That's usually the off-year election time. Then you have the persuasive period, usually about 4 to 6 months before the election. Then you have GOTV. Presidential candidates in the base building time and in the GOTV time will spend time where they're where they have the most support, and then in the persuasion time trying to minimize the risk in the areas where they have the least support. What that means is Republican candidates will be spending, nationally, would be spending most of their time during the base building time and in the GOTV time in building infrastructure in Republican areas, which in every part of the country, which they don't do right now. And then they would spend their time in the urban areas during the persuasive time, trying to minimize the parts that they would lose in the persuasive time. So ultimately, what you would see is an allocation of different resources and different time by different candidates based on what part of the campaign they're in and what they think would see most benefits of. But indeed, the urban areas would get some, because there's lots of votes there, they would get attention, but they wouldn't get all the attention because you can't win. The total number of voters in the 50 largest cities is only 17% of the vote. You can't win with 17% of the vote. You're going to have to go into all parts of the country in order to win an election. You know, and the question you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about your constituents is, when your constituents wake up in the morning the day after the presidential election, do they say, oh boy, my candidate lost, but at least Pennsylvania's electoral votes went to my candidate? Or did they go, and so I'm happy about the outcome? Or do they go, oh darn, my candidate lost, and they lost? The fact is, most folks don't know, state by state, how their electors are appointed. Most people look at where the vote is and whether or not their guy wins or loses. The bottom line is, the will of Pennsylvania, if it is the will of Pennsylvania, if you want to say what is the will of the state, whether it's the will of California or the will of the voters of the state of Pennsylvania or the will of the voters of the state of California, quite frankly, if you actually want to go, I'm not a you know, what's the most popular thing kind of guy. I don't think you ought to read a poll and make a determination on what's the best thing to do. Most people think the winner of the guy who gets the most votes ought to be the winner of an election. And in every other election in the country, the person who gets the most votes wins the election. Would it be the will of the people of Pennsylvania or your district that the person who gets the most votes should be president? I think that's what your voters would think, and they would ask you to do that if they are actually put to it, had the question put to them. I don't think that's why you ought to make the determination. I think you ought to make the determination on whether or not the current system actually promotes national elections on national issues. And quite frankly, it doesn't, and I think the outcome, the policy outcome, has been negative in most cases. If you look at Miami-Dade County, voter fraud in Miami-Dade County can be very compact, very secret, and change who becomes president of the United States. Or Madison, Wisconsin, voter fraud there can be very secret, very compact, and change who becomes president of the United States. Pulling off voter fraud to change who is president of the United States in all 50 states, all of a sudden it would take a massive conspiracy. And the great thing about conspiracies is the more people that are involved in them, the more likely they are to be exposed. So voter fraud would actually have much, much less impact in an election where every vote is counted in every single state. And ask yourself this, and I'm a conservative Republican. Voter fraud in California is mainly done by the government union types, and they do it because they want to impact they want to impact a school board election or a city council election or a local county supervisor election, because that's where their contracts are written. They're already committing all the voter fraud they can in order to win those elections. In LA and in San Francisco, it's rampant right now. They don't care as much about the president of the United States. They're not going to increase the amount of voter fraud that they are using in order to change who becomes the president of the United States, because they care more about the local election and their contracts and the dues that come out of that than they do about the president. The president doesn't impact them that much. Quite frankly, if you can pull off voter fraud in Miami-Dade, or you can pull off voter fraud in Madison in 10 or 15 or 20 people, 15 or 20,000 votes, that can change presidential outcomes and stay secret, and they never go to jail for it. If they try to do it on a national level, they'll get caught.
I would just quickly add, because I'm sure they have, a solid example is, I believe, 2004, George Bush, John Kerry. Much easier if you were committed to perpetrating a fraud to shift 59,000 votes or so in the state of Ohio than it would have been to change 3.5 million or so, 3.4 million nationally. The smaller the sample, the easier it is to do, which is one of the reasons I'm not a fan of the congressional district race, because then you can focus on fewer areas and they're specific.
But the bottom line is, if you combine Wyoming with Utah, with Idaho, with Montana, and that sort of central part of the country, truth is, you start adding their votes together, they will actually deliver more votes for a Republican candidate than California delivers for a Democrat candidate. Yet, if you add their electoral college votes together right now, there are only 30 electoral votes, and California is 53. So even though you get a majority of that swath of states that got cut through the middle, as a presidential candidate, you get fewer electoral college votes. If in a national popular vote system, you got more votes out of that swath of area, if you spent some time and you spent some effort addressing the issues that's important to them, you will actually win an election, and you will counteract completely what happens in California. Those states in the middle delivered 1.6 million votes in 2004 to George W. Bush. California, 1.2 million to John Kerry. George W. Bush got 30 electoral votes. John Kerry got 53. Though right now it makes Wyoming and Idaho and Montana and all those states in that central area much less significant, particularly to a Republican candidate, because you're going to get the votes anyway, and you don't have to address their issues. And as a result, a lot of the resource issues and the economic issues that are important to those folks get completely ignored. And I can just tell you that when you're doing a popular vote thing, that 80%, actually in a small area, 80% of the vote starts making big differences if it's only 52% of the vote in a big area. I don't know where you get your votes from in your areas, but there are precincts where you're stronger and precincts where you're weaker. And if you ran campaigns like I used to run my campaigns, in the off-year times, I spent my time in the areas where I was stronger, building my base and building my infrastructure, so that when it came time to do GOTV, those votes were turned out. And I made efforts to make sure I had a good GOTV effort. Bottom line is, yeah, I will give you this, just kind of on your other comment. My district was actually polled as the most conservative district in the state of California, and I represented my constituents well.
Greater opportunity for fraud, and where we find it is when you can focus on specific areas. For instance, in the election that I just had myself very personally, we know that there are three wards, in the city of Minneapolis where the average voter turnout in a non-presidential year up to 2010 had been 45 to 55%. Magically, in November of 2010, it hit 80%. Why is that important? Because the more you can focus the areas, and I'm not saying that your theory that it could happen in all different areas, but to say that these would be coordinated conspiracies, I think is really difficult the greater the area you get. The bigger concern I have, and the personal experience that I've seen, is it's focused in very definable areas amongst I'll use Mr. England's words, these experts, they slice and dice it. You don't think that the persons who would be committed to perpetrating a fraud wouldn't know right where they needed to go?
We all know how to run a popular election campaign. We all run them. That's what we do. There's size and scope, obviously. I mean, some are bigger and some are smaller. Does voter fraud occur today? Yes. My contention is it occurs as much as it possibly can right now because of the interests of the parties that participate in that. All of these things occur. It all happens. But what we end up doing, the question that we need to ask ourselves are, our current campaign strategies, are they beneficial to this country as a whole under the current system or under a different system? The great thing about national popular vote is this. If a state comes to the determination that they do not are not benefiting from a national popular vote system. Under that interstate compact, they have the right to withdraw. You know, we actually have a really big interstate compact where you don't have the right to withdraw. We fought a war over making sure that you didn't have the right to, the state didn't have a right to withdraw. National popular vote, if the state comes to determination it's not in their benefit, they can withdraw, and the compact goes away. In the end, the question you need to ask yourself is, on a policy level, are national elections on national issues better for the country than national elections on regional issues? Under national popular vote, you get national elections on national issues. Under the current system, you get national elections on regional issues, focused on a few states, and sometimes as few as 6 states. Is that what's good for the country? Is it good to disenfranchise 225 million voters where a president candidate never goes to, 98% of the money in 15 states? Is that a good thing for this country? I personally believe it is not. That's ultimately what changed my mind on this whole concept. I came to it after 6 months of study. It's a good thing being a conservative, because you actually go out and you have to think and study before you want to become a supporter of a big change. I did. I came to that conclusion, changed my mind on it.